All right. Hello, everyone. Today, what I'm going to do is I'll outline just a couple concepts to emphasize what happens when we shift one of these aggregate demand or aggregate supply curves, and how these impact our price level, real GDP, and unemployment. Those are our three major macroeconomic indicators, and so we want to get some context as to when we influence one of these sides of our macroeconomy, what's going to be the overall aggregate impact on our three major indicators. So, right here, we can see that we have our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We have our starting equilibrium point, and then we have our long run aggregate supply measuring our full employment or our potential GDP. Now, if we influence our aggregate demand, meaning we influence one of these variables. So, for example, let's say we implement something like our COVID relief payments. And so, as a result, these look like our stimulus checks. If we implement our COVID relief payments, that is intended to increase consumption, but the immediate thing that occurs is that we're going to have to increase government expenditure. And so when we increase government expenditure, or as a result, we're increasing government expenditure by distributing direct transfers to all of these citizens who are below a certain income threshold. Then we have to apply our ceteris paribus assumption, meaning we're going to hold consumption, investment, and our net exports constant, and as a result, holding those constant, increasing government spending will boost aggregate demand. Following that increase, we're going to see our aggregate demand curve shift to the right. And so we get this new aggregate demand curve, and I'll add a new subscript here, aggregate demand 1. So, following the COVID relief payments, we boosted government spending that shifted aggregate demand to the right. I draw my new shift here, and I'm able to illustrate the impact on my three major indicators. If we go from our new equilibrium point, I now have a new equilibrium output. Oops. I now have a new equilibrium output at Y1. I now have a new equilibrium price level at P1. And so, what's the impact on my three major macro indicators? The first two are easy. We've increased the price level from P0 to P1, so we're going to have to give up a little bit of inflation when we stimulate the economy like this. And we saw this following the stimulus checks. We're also going to increase output. And so what happens is, first, we had that direct increase in government expenditure, but this is also going to have that spillover effect by increasing consumption. All these individuals receive these direct transfers. That's going to increase output. So we've successfully stimulated the economy at the sacrifice of a little bit of inflation. And the last thing we want to compare is our unemployment. Remember that this gap between our initial equilibrium and the full employment level was our cyclical unemployment. So we had a decent level of cyclical unemployment at the initial equilibrium. After we close that gap here, and so when we close this distance between our new equilibrium output and the full employment level, when we close that distance, we're able to reduce unemployment. And so that's what happens with a stimulus or any type of increase. So if you cut taxes, if you any of our expansionary fiscal policy options, provide something like the Obama stimulus package or the Donald Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, all of those options are expansionary fiscal policy, and they'll have the same impact on these three major indicators, ceteris paribus. Let's take a look at what happens if we do the opposite, if we implement some contractionary fiscal policy. And so these would look like things like income or an increase on income taxes. So we could do just some examples here, an increase in income taxes, or an increase in corporate taxes. These are all potential options. These are options for contractionary fiscal policy. And let's center our focus here on, let's do consumption. So we're going to increase income taxes, meaning we're taking disposable income away from people. As a result, ceteris paribus, what we're going to see is a decline in consumption. And ceteris paribus, we hold government spending, we hold investment and net exports constant. We should see a decline in our aggregate demand. Whenever we see a decrease in aggregate demand, that means we're going to see a shift to the left in our aggregate demand curve. Here's my new AD1. I identify my new equilibrium point, and I get my new equilibrium price level and my new equilibrium output level. And so what we're trying to do with these policies, these contractionary policies, we're trying to cut back, scale back the economy or slow it down. And so we've increased income taxes. As a result, we've seen a decline in consumption, and we've reduced the price level from P0 to P1. We've also reduced the output level from Y0 to Y1. Reduce the output level from Y0 to Y1. And we've actually increased the amount of cyclical unemployment by increasing this gap between our equilibrium output and the full employment level. And so, generally, when we're implementing these types of policies, we're thinking about trying to combat inflation. And so the concern there is that we might have something spiraling out of control, and so as a result, we implement some type of contractionary fiscal policy to reduce aggregate demand here, trying to cut down on the price level. But those are our two aggregate demand side shifts. I want to just quickly take a look, and these ones are mapped out nicely. These reflect what's happening in your slides, but take a look at things that can influence the supply side. We have much fewer options here, but a couple of them deal with input prices. And so input prices are prices that go into the production process. So as a producer, what are all the things that we end up paying for? The biggest things that will have the biggest impact will be resources that are utilized by a lot of different firms, or things like labor, which are essential to all firms in the U.S. And so the examples that I highlight in the slide is like something that could increase aggregate supply would be a decrease in these input prices. And so, like in real terms, what does that look like? Well, one of the things could be a decline in oil prices. And so even though we're moving towards a more sustainable economy, right now we have a lot of firms that are still reliant on fossil fuels. And so if we had a huge reduction, if we had a reduction in our oil prices, that would shift our aggregate supply to the right. As a result, we get this new equilibrium. That's this point here. At that new equilibrium, we have our new equilibrium price, and we see that our price level has dropped from P0 to P1. Whoops, on the wrong side. From P0 to P1. We've also seen an increase in our output level from Y0 to Y1. And we've closed this gap. And so we've cut down on unemployment. And so increases in the aggregate supply size, if we're able to reduce these input prices, these are best case scenarios for the economy. We get a reduction in the price level, so the average price of all goods falls for consumers. We also see an increase in the output level, so we see some economic growth, and we're cutting back on unemployment. We're cutting down that cyclical unemployment. So increases in aggregate supply give us the best case scenario. And lastly, we have our worst case scenario. And so worst case scenario is just the opposite side of that coin. Let's say we get something like an increase in input prices. increase in input prices can look something like that increase in oil prices. And so because firms are so reliant on it, if we see a substantial increase in oil prices, that's going to increase input costs for all producers. As a result, we're going to see our aggregate supply shift to the left from aggregate supply 0 to the short on aggregate supply 1. At that new equilibrium level here, we see an increase in the price level. We also see a decrease in the output level, and worst case scenario here, we also see an increase in cyclical unemployment. And so this is what we refer to as stagflation. It's a period in which growth is declining, we have high inflation, and on top of that, we're also seeing an increase in cyclical unemployment. And so aggregate supply can either give us the best case scenario, where we get a decrease in the price level, an increase in growth, and we cut back on unemployment, or we can see the worst case scenario, in which we have increasing inflation, we have stagnant growth, and we see an increase in cyclical unemployment. But that's the primary focus of this unit, is being able to navigate these shifts and think about contextually how do different policies impact these different figures.